Good afternoon. I'm in Geneva, Switzerland at the moment, and it's early on a Sunday morning, but I think you've been having discussions for almost 2 days now, and I'm very happy to join you. I'm definitely going to talk more broadly about sustainability, sustainable development, what it is, how we understand it, how we approach it as institutions, as people, as societies. But what I'm going to say certainly resonates with Professor Lavinia's message that sustainability is not just about the environment, it's very much about social justice, it's very much about reducing inequalities, it's about human rights, and it's about respect. And I'll go into why that's the case. And then I was asked to offer some thoughts on what needs to change, the role of education, and the importance of partnerships. So that's how I'm going to structure what I want to say. Just let me begin by telling you a little bit about UNRISD. I'm the head of a research institute in the UN, and we're an autonomous research institute, which means we have independence to do research which is often more critical than some of the research that you might come across. We have research programs on what we call transformative social policy. We have a research program on gender justice and development. We have a research program on alternative economies for transformation, which is about how we restructure our economic system and how we govern that. And then we have a program on environmental and climate justice. And together, we hope that those contribute to reducing inequalities around the world, and also contributing to a new understanding of how people can live sustainably and peacefully on the planet. Now, unfortunately, one of the best ways to understand sustainability, its complexity, its many components, what we would call multi-dimensionality, is to talk about unsustainability. And I'm sure you've heard a lot about this in the last couple of days, so I'll try to keep it brief. Let me start with the environment, because this is actually how most people understand sustainability when they first start thinking about it. And one of the most famous definitions is from our Common Future, or the Brundtland Report from the 1980s, which said that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, the various types of unsustainability that we've got going on in the world, you'll be aware of. We've got climate change as a result of human activity. Tremendous human progress in some countries and some places, but with the use of fossil fuels that have changed our atmosphere, that have warmed our atmosphere, and that are contributing, of course, to extreme weather events. We've got huge degradation of our planet's ecosystems, deforestation because we're seeking timber and we're seeking more agricultural lands. We've got desertification, again, down to cutting down vegetation, overgrazing, soil erosion, and climate change. We've got overfishing in our oceans and lakes. We've got pollution. We've got bleached coral reefs because of rising sea temperatures, and the risk that we may permanently affect the currents of water running around the world. And because of that, we have a huge threat to the animals and plants, the biodiversity that lives and depends in these ecosystems. Now, yesterday was World Biodiversity Day, and you may have known that, but the current rate of global biodiversity loss is estimated to be somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times higher than the naturally occurring extinction rate. So we're killing animals, plants, and insects and fish at a faster rate than any time in human history. So in 2021, almost 40,000 species were threatened with extinction, compared to just over 16,000 in 2006. We've got pollution in the air because of the fuels we use for transport and heating, and we've got an increasing number of extreme weather events, hurricanes, typhoons, and flooding. And all of those are caused by humans, our sheer number, our overuse and overexploitation of resources, and our unhealthy relationship with nature. But a key driver as Professor Lavinia said, is also the divides we see between people on the planet. Still around the world, a lot of people still live in extreme poverty, and even above extreme poverty, a lot of people still live in poverty in many dimensions. And people don't want to be poor, and they want to consume as much as their neighbors and do the same things, but that's completely understandable. But it's happening at the same time when living standards and consumption are continuing to rise in rich countries, perhaps even at a faster rate. And that's indicative of huge global inequalities, both within countries and between countries. So going back to that definition that Grundmann used in the 1980s, sustainability is when we meet people's current needs without compromising the needs of the future. And it's very clear that not only are we not meeting current needs, we're also destroying the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Now, those needs are not just money. Poverty has many different faces. It can mean a lack of food, nutrition, housing, shelter, education, healthcare, clean water, sanitation, transport, jobs, even green spaces. So not meeting the current needs and spoiling the chance of future generations, we're dealing in the realms of thorough unsustainability. But unfortunately, that's not even the full story. As we degrade and abuse our natural resources, we're reducing the space for well-being even of our current populations, even of the people living on the planet now. Climate change and extreme weather pushes people into poverty and insecurity, potentially more so in poorer parts of the world. It's a triple injustice because the people who least contributed to climate change are the ones suffering the worst consequences and those that have the fewest resources to deal with it. And recently on COVID-19 is going to push another 150 million people at least around the world into extreme poverty. And that came as a result of a transfer of disease from animals, a zoonotic disease. So our unhealthy relationship with nature is also driving social injustice, poverty, and inequality. Now, the connector between these unsustainabilities is our economic behavior, our consumption, our failure to incorporate what we call environmental externalities in production and consumption, our trade and our transport, and our failure to tackle and incorporate the costs of our waste and pollution. Now, our economic behavior is largely short-term, and for the health of the planet and society, we need to be thinking long-term. Now, these challenges that we face are well known. I'm sure they're well known to you. And there is an agreement signed by governments, brokered at the UN, to address them. It's called the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and it has a number of global goals underneath it, what are called Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of them, and they address aspects of people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnerships. All of the things that we talked about just now, poverty, inequality, health, education, biodiversity, ecosystems, are also covered goal by goal in that agenda. Importantly, the goals are universal, which means that they're for all countries, all societies, and all people. And critically, they pledge to leave no one behind and to reach the furthest away first. So that's irrespective of race, ethnicity, whether we're talking about indigenous peoples, regardless of age, disability, gender, or any other characteristic. Now, these are not the UN's goals, meaning that it's up to the UN to meet them. And even though governments have signed up to them, they're not government's goals. And they're not just business goals, although businesses will have to change a lot of what they're doing if we're to make the goals real. NGOs on their own are not going to meet them either, because they're everyone's goals, and every person in the world has a role in making sure that they're met. So a key question then becomes, how can they be made everyone's goals? How can we make sustainability everyone's business? And how can people in their own capacity contribute? And that brings us to education and the power of education and this conference. Now, I have to say up front, my background as a heterodox economist, which is an economist that also understands other stuff, but my background isn't in education. It's not my area of study or expertise, but I do want to offer just a few personal reflections on the role of education, because education has its own goal in the global goals. It pledges to make sure that every child around the world has access to free, equitable primary and secondary education, that access to tertiary education is clear, and opportunities for lifelong learning are sustained. But also, education is instrumental to progress on all of the other goals. Better education helps to reduce poverty. It helps to reach good health. It helps to reach gender equality. It helps to actually respect nature and the planet that we live in. So education is a building block for sustainability. And that's recognized in one of the targets under these global goals, which says that by 2030, ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, among others through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, and the promotion of a culture of peace and non-violence. We're only at the point now where we're developing a data set to understand whether that's happening or not. It's led by a bit of the UN called UNESCO, which concentrates on science, culture, and education. But a personal reflection, this needs to be done not just by teaching about sustainability on its own, as if it were a separate subject, but also as an integral part of other subject areas. Now, when I was learning, when I was at university and I did economics, there were options that you could choose which were about the environment or which were about development. Now, the thing about the environment is that it's central to economics. So all economics is environmental economics, but environmental economics was taught as an add-on, as an extra thing that you could even choose not to study. And I'm sure it's the same for business studies these days. When you go and study business studies at university or in schools after you finish primary and secondary education, you're probably taught about how to start a business, how to get money to run it, how to handle your human resources. But only if you opt into the modules on sustainability, you're going to be taught about how to protect the planet. And that's simply not good enough. We've got to make sure that sustainability is not an add-on, that it's integrated into all of the relevant topics at all levels of schooling. And to give a few examples, that means chemistry, because the chemicals that we produce, including the artificial ones, interact with nature, sometimes in positive ways, but often in detrimental ways, and undermine our efforts to sustainability. It has to be mainstreamed into physics and engineering because of the availability of raw materials, which then leads to how we treat mining around the world and how we displace people to get to the raw materials that we need for our phones or for our new energy technologies. Sustainability needs to be at the heart of chemistry, of physics, of engineering, of history. But even in topics like sport, we've had, I saw that we had several sessions on sport and sustainability. Sustainability needs to feature in all of these topics. Now, if you tackle sustainability properly through education, properly, then within 30 years, you've got people in politics, in government, in business, and running their own businesses. You have people as civic leaders who understand sustainability and have it in their DNA. Now, of course, you'll always get people who don't listen to that schooling or who are drawn to the dark side of a thirst for profits at any cost, which is why you also need laws, regulations, incentives, and penalties. But that's so much easier if you're building up from an educational base, if sustainability is the world's school lesson. Now, just a few words on partnerships to conclude. Now, from my perspective, the incorporation of sustainability in curricula has to be led by educators with the support of students. Not only are they the experts on pedagogical approaches, but they also play an invaluable role in understanding context, in understanding culture, drawing on local realities and local examples, and crafting lessons that can properly take root. The most important partnerships within countries and across countries are between educators, both individuals and institutions. That said, the ground also needs to be laid to ensure receptiveness. Governments are key enablers and often key constrainers because of the influence that they have on curricula. That's where NGOs, advocates, social movements can play a critical role, because education is also political. And you have to understand that anything to do with politics is about power. And education is a means to empower people so that they can live the lives that they want to lead. So control of curricula is political. And I think that was very evident in the video that Professor Lavinia showed. Now, my experience of how other successful partnerships grow is that they start off small. They show success and impact, they garner support, and they build momentum over time. And it does take time. Now, internationally, the UN can lend support, notably through the organization that I mentioned a while ago, UNESCO. For its part, as a research institute, my organization works on something called an ecosocial contract, which is this idea that for too long, the environment and society have been treated separately. And indeed, the movements around the world that focus on environmental justice and those that focus on social justice have been coming together in a beautiful way in the last 15, 20 years, and are increasingly working together to ensure a new type of relationship between those who govern and those who are governed, one that seeks to make sure that all human rights are met, that economic behavior becomes a supporter and not a destroyer of the environment, and that underpinning it, we have a new idea about distribution and equity, what we would call a new fiscal contract. So to conclude, just with 6 points to reiterate what I said. The first is that the world is on an unsustainable path currently in many dimensions. Second, we actually know what sustainability looks like. It's in different environmental and social components, and the role of economic behavior as the driver or constraint on sustainability. Third, we have a global agenda on sustainability, the global goals brokered by people, governments, and business around the world, and housed within the UN with some responsibility for all to meet them. Fourth, the move to sustainability is a shift that will take time, economically, in our behaviors, in our cultures, particularly our culture of economic behavior. Fifth, education plays a critical role in not only teaching, but also mainstreaming sustainability in all topics. And sixth, partnerships between educators the world over will lead this shift, and others can help them where possible, where necessary, and where appropriate. So that's what I wanted to say. I hope you have had a brilliant conference. I hope the rest of the day is also great, and I'll be sticking around in case you have any questions for me for the rest of this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director Paul. We were able to learn important things such as the different sectors of unsustainability and how the said sectors would affect us. We appreciate that you highlighted the importance of education as it helps everyone to achieve the sustainable goals by the UN. Indeed, having the proper education helps us to have a better world. Now, if you have any questions for Director Paul and Dr. Tony, we encourage you to type them in the chat box. Okay, so we have one question from Richard and Pamdel Rosario to Dean Tony Lavinia. The Philippines has one of the most progressive laws in recognizing the rights of its indigenous people in the IPIRA. We even have the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples to advance their concerns. And yet, in spite of the passage of the said law more than 23 years ago, our IPs are still marginalized and worse, many are even persecuted and taken advantage of. Is the problem more with the implementation of law or how our society views IP in general, or both? What should be done for what should be done more for them?
Thank you, Shella, for that question. And that actually reminded me to emphasize one more thing why I chose that video for this session for that conference, which is that, and Paul also reminded me of that, one, we know what sustainability is. And one of that actually is what indigenous peoples do, how indigenous peoples manage their resources, the ancestral domain. There's lots of things we can learn from them. I'm not gonna romanticize them, especially in the world today where we have so many challenges for those communities as well. They too have to evolve and learn how to become even more sustainable in a very, in a climate challenge world, in a coronavirus challenged world. But definitely, there's lots of things we can learn from them, and that is why we enacted the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act in 1997. Disclosure: I was the let me put it this way: the first version of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act was in my computer, very clunky old computer, in 1990 or earlier, maybe 88, 89, when I was just a young lawyer. Um, and our group, we were an NGO called the Legal Rights and Natural Resources Center. Actually, uh, Teacher Rochelle was one of our colleagues. Later on, not at the time, she's too young to have been started with this at that time. But we lobbied for the law, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, which we were able to pass. Then I'm very lucky because I helped draft it as an NGO person. But when it was adopted by Congress, enacted into law in 1997, I was Undersecretary of Environment, Deputy Minister of Environment of the Philippines, and was in charge of steering it through the process in Congress, and we had actually had it adopted. And it's a very good law. It's 10 years ahead of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples borrowed from our law a lot because many Filipinos were also active in the UNDRIP, the United Nations process that led to that declaration. So what went wrong? Well, we realized that implementation is different from enactment. That you might have a good law, but if you don't implement it properly, and you don't have the political will and the institutions to implement it, the victory is going to be Pyrrhic. It's not going to be final. And that's why when I became the dean of the Ateneo School of Government, I directed a lot of our work to teaching officials of the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples. I mentor many of them. I mean, I'm very proud to have done that and trained many of them. But I realized even that is not enough, because really, in the end, even indigenous peoples cannot rely on government, cannot rely on um, on bureaucrats to assert their rights. They need to do it themselves, and that's why education is so important. I mean, that's why I showed you that video. As sad as it is, as challenged as they are, these kids know, and their parents know, that that's their future, because they have to be the one to strike up the partnerships with us. For example, with your school, for example, or with the schools that are here, to strike up partnerships with international organizations like UNDP and others, because they do that also, and even with government, when government is open and willing. So that's where we are. It's a struggle. It's a constant struggle. There are good moments and there are bad moments. I'm sorry, but in the Philippines, we're in a bad moment right now, because we're in a bad moment of human rights. I do not deny that, and we have to be very frank about that. But there are also many good moments that will happen. That's happening. The community pantry movement, and even this assertion of indigenous peoples, indigenous children, of the right to education is, I think, a really good thing also. But the struggle must continue until we get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tony. We have a question for Director Paul from Tristan. How radical should we be? How radical should we be? Should the transformation be in our systems in order to achieve the sustainable goals? Should we comprise, or should we be ambitious in our platforms?
Yes, I mean, different people will use different words, and radical is subjective, but we are heading so fast in the wrong direction, particularly in terms of how we manage our economies and our economic behaviors across the world, that yes, the change to that needs to be fast and radical. What can I say more about that? I'll give you one example. Another question which I noted in the comment box was about the behavior of large companies, particularly ones that sort of cross borders. And there are lots of things that are wrong with some of the behaviors of these companies. They don't sort of have their life in the countries that they operate in. They often don't pay the taxes that are needed to keep schools and health systems running. They don't care for the environment in the localities where they're working, often where they're taking resources from and selling to other parts of the world. Now, at the end of the day, it's down to governments to sort that out. The UN, the United Nations, is how governments get together and agree to do things or not. The UN Civil Service, of which I'm a part, produces evidence and reports and tries to point out what's going wrong and tries to encourage governments and business to act better. But at the end of the day, it's people and governments that have to take business to task. But there are really good examples around the world of people doing things differently. We have a research program on something called the social and solidarity economy, which is about entrepreneurs, sometimes for profit, but often not for profit, who prioritize environmental and social objectives in their business models. So they employ people, they pay them well, they have a gender balanced workforce that's diverse, but they also are very cautious about how they use resources and how their products are used and sold, in their countries and in their communities. So there are strong examples of how economic behavior can change. And that I mentioned the social and solidarity economy, increasingly in countries around the world of all income levels, Costa Rica, Morocco, Quebec in Canada, in many other countries, this is really taking off as an alternative as people realize that the changes we need will very much take us away from business as normal, and very much take us into what we call radical now, but actually won't be radical in the future once we have sort of thought about and mainstreamed the urgency of the task ahead of us.
Thank you very much, Director Paul. We have another one for Dean Tony Lavinia. From Brent, is there any way to protect the indigenous groups, and what are the ways that we as students can do?
Yes. There's several ways, of course. I mean, which is I mean, there's the legal side, so that's well taken care of. Several lawyers are doing the work. I'm one of the lawyers that are working with them. Um, Reaching out to the schools that are, for example, here in Manila, the Bakwit School, which is not too far away from you in UP, would be good actually to check how you could help. I mean, from very basic things like food and their own daily needs, because they're doing that to even helping out in terms of absorbing some of them in some of our schools. I've actually talked about that with teacher Rochelle for John Dewey. Because that's actually what's been happening. We've been sending those children to different schools right now because it's all online, right? So we're able to enroll them in other schools so that they don't lose the year, as many students all over the Philippines. Although I have to say that what's sad is the minors, the ones who are below 18, we've had to ask the parents to pick them up because there's just too many challenges if you're a minor and not in your house. I mean, so that's essentially been done, and that means, I mean, they'll probably lose a year or 2 years of education, certainly another year. I know that this next year will still be essentially a lost year for many of our public schools. Now, for many of, especially our remote schools, there's no way they can have uh, um, remote learning in the mountains. Now that you saw in that video, there's no way that it's gonna happen. But you know what? What's needed is solidarity. That's really what's needed. If you can, of course, it's been difficult this year because we can't also meet face to face, but maybe there are ways of meeting them through online also. You know what I mean? Ways. Then listen to their stories. Now, that's very important. I've been an Indigenous people's rights lawyer for more than 30 years. Um, and it's very important to start by listening, because the stories are very different and the lives are very different. It's not how we see, it's not how we've experienced things. I mean, I've worked also in a lot of international conventions. I've been the main negotiator of the Philippines on climate change for many years. Not anymore now, but up to Paris in 2015, I was doing that, and always trying to echo indigenous peoples all over the world, and very important to listen to actually what they want and what they think. That's the most important thing, more than handouts, more than, it's knowing that they are heard and listened to, because they are what I call invisible peoples also in many of our societies, not listened to, ignored, disregarded, marginalized.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tony. After watching the video you shared, we as students feel the strong urge to help the indigenous people. Apologies, everyone. Due to the time constraint, we will be collecting some of the questions and we will be sending them to our keynote speakers.